Senator Kelly, this is Colonel William Stryker.
William Stryker.
Okay, so I have a board here. Means we're getting fucking serious.
I'm going to title this.
This is our William Stryker timeline. William Stryker is a character played by 3 different actors across at least 2 different timelines across the X-Men franchise. He first appears as Brian Cox in X2, X-Men United, which you think would take place sometime during the 2000s, but canonically it takes place in the not too distant future. Now it can't be too far too distant into the not too distant future, because in the first movie they came out in the year 2000, the Twin Towers are still there. So it's early 2000s. We're just gonna call it 2000 and X, cause that sounds cool. So William Stryker is the scientist / military guy who put Wolverine into adamantium. Put adamantium into Wolverine. And even that is like slightly inconsistent because his origin has changed a little bit in the comics over the time too. Like as he says in that movie, he's like, "You were always an animal, Wolverine. I just gave you claws." But then like, he already had claws. They were just bone and you made them metal, but whatever. Let's not worry about that. I just more want to talk about like how often this guy shows up, even though he's really only important in 2 movies, X-Men 2 and Origins Wolverine. But couple main things. He gave Wolverine claws, or at least he gave him adamantium claws. He also has a son named Jason, who is important because he has some kind of psychic powers and he's able to create this illusion that almost makes Xavier kill everyone on Earth. He's a mutant, and Brian Cox doesn't like that. He's disappointed in him. He also mentions that he fought in Vietnam. There's a scene where he's talking to, what's his name? Senator Kelly, except it's actually Mystique, but that's unimportant. Where he's like, "I was killing civilians in Saigon back when you were in junior high, dickhead." And that actually comes back a couple times. So the next time we see or hear from William Stryker is in X-Men Origins Wolverine, where he's played by Danny Huston, a completely different guy who doesn't look at all like Brian Cox. He barely looks like a younger guy. Like he looks like he's maybe 10 years younger than Brian Cox, and this is at least 20 years before he's gonna end up looking like Brian Cox. So we're already off to a slightly confusing start, just from a casting perspective of the guy that doesn't at all look like a younger version of the older guy. Anyways, so we do Origins Wolverine. He first meets Wolverine in Vietnam, which I guess would be towards the end of the Vietnam War, I guess. So somewhere in the 60s to 70s, Vietnam happens. And that's where he first meets Wolverine, and then he recruits him to do some other, just as, if not more, shady missions in third world countries. Alex, you can't even read that. Come on, what am I doing? And then a few years go by, and then he puts adamantium into Wolverine and erases his memory with a silver bullet. And that's Origins Wolverine. And then that leads back around to X-Men 2 eventually. So far, not too confusing, apart from a guy who doesn't look anything like him. We also have a reference again to Jason. He's in here too. He's in like a tube or something, and he's like a little kid. But remember how he had a son named Jason who had a heterochromia? So we're going to put that in there too, because that's the thing we know about Brian Cox, is that he went to Vietnam and he has a son named Jason. Okay, the next time that William Stryker is mentioned is actually all the way back in X-Men First Class, which takes place in 1962. And one of the military guys who's in this movie is named like Colonel Stryker or something like that. And then Xavier reads his mind in one scene and he's like, "Oh, that's nice. You're thinking about your son, William." So Stryker Senior is in this movie, and he's in like a couple scenes and he's like, "Oh, mutants, I don't like him. We should, be worried about them as a threat or whatever." And he's got a son named William. And that's And that's important because we know that he's going to become William Stryker one day and put metal into Wolverine. And that's we've got to remember that there's a guy named William Stryker who will eventually put metal in Wolverine. We got to reference that. So then the next time that William Stryker shows up is in Days of Future Past, which takes place in the early 70s. And he's played by Josh Hellman, a third guy who also doesn't look like Brian Cox. He kind of looks like Danny Houston, but not that much. And also, neither of them look like Brian Cox. He's in this movie, and he is like working for Trask, Peter Dinklage, who's the main human guy who doesn't like mutants and is trying to build killer robots. But he shares a lot of the same sentiments of like, oh yeah, the mutants are bad news bears. Oh yeah, also we first meet him in Vietnam, so that comes back. Vietnam is back again, and they're leaving Vietnam because they lost.
We did not lose Vietnam. It was a tie.
Anyways, he's there, and he has like a squad of mutants who were doing like, I guess, missions in Vietnam or something. So that's like similar to the stuff that he was doing in Origins Wolverine, but it doesn't, like, it's a different group of mutants. So maybe this is just like he's got a bunch of different off the books mutant teams fighting in Vietnam or something, or it's just a different thing and don't think about it. He's mostly just kind of around Trask in a lot of these scenes. He doesn't do a whole lot himself. There is a scene where Trask is like, how's your son doing? And he's like, oh, my son Jason, he's doing fine. He's almost 10. So, because remember, he has a son named Jason. Remember, that's a thing that was established in X-Men 2, is that he has a son named Jason, and then he fought in Vietnam. So in Days of Future Past, we see him in Vietnam, and we mention that he has a son named Jason. A lot of these movies have scenes where either William Stryker or one of his relatives mentions that they have a son, and that their son will go on to be an X2 eventually. Like that's because remember in X2 when Brian Cox was there and he had a son and he mentioned that he fought in Vietnam and then he was like, "You one day people will finish when I started Wolverine one day." Remember that? So then, because Days of Future Past thinks you're a fucking idiot, and the fact that there's a guy named William Stryker in this movie and he doesn't like mutants and he's working with a guy who doesn't like mutants and he fought in Vietnam and he mentions that he has a son named Jason who has heterochromia, they also hit you over the head even more by having a scene where Wolverine somehow recognizes Josh Hellman as William Stryker, even though he doesn't look like the guy he met in Origins Wolverine or the guy he met in X2, but somehow he recognizes that this guy is gonna be Brian Cox one day. So he suddenly gets all these flashbacks of when he got the metal put in him. Because remember, William Stryker is the guy that put the metal in Wolverine, and we gotta remind you that that's what's gonna happen one day. That Wolverine has metal in him. Did you know that? So then the best thing ever happens, when he's having this flashback, they do the in case you still didn't get that he was gonna become Brian Cox. They do this terrible 90s Animorphs effect from Josh Hellman into Brian Cox because you're too stupid to realize that this is supposed to be the same guy. Probably because, once again, none of these actors look like each other, and so then they like firmly establish that William Stryker will become William Stryker, aka Brian Cox. And just when you thought it couldn't get more confusing, this movie ends on a weird cliffhanger where Wolverine gets thrown into the water, and then William Stryker, Josh Hellman, picks him out of the water and is like, oh, that's interesting. This guy should be dead, but he's alive still. I bet I could think of something interesting to do with him. And it's kind of like a weird, oh no, even though we've changed some things about the past, this stuff will still kind of circle around to being where it was already. But then his eyes flash yellow to imply that he's actually Mystique. This is never referenced again, and I don't know what it means or why. And the next movie, which is, oh yeah, this also goes to a different timeline, which we're going to put over here. This is the Josh Hellman timeline. And around the same time of Origins Wolverine, in the early 80s, we got a brand new movie called Apocalypse, and that's another movie that happens. And in that movie, they make absolutely no attempt to explain the Mystique eyes. Just not at all. They don't explain it. They just don't explain it. Moving on. Like, I would be fine with literally the briefest of explanations of just like Mystique was pretending to be Stryker for some reason. And maybe she was like, oh, I can find all the other mutants that he's got held captive, because presumably he's got more than one. And then maybe I can set them free. Maybe that was her plan. Let's say that. That feels in line with Mystique. But then when she got there, she had really planned her timing wrong, and regular William Stryker was also there. And then there was 2 William Strykers in the room, and then she just abandoned that plan and left altogether, leaving Wolverine to be captured by the real Stryker. That's my headcanon, and that's me doing a lot of writing that the movies didn't, so that's not really maybe, like, I'm trying to figure out how this makes sense, because it doesn't, because Mystique, he had Mystique eyes at the end, and I think it wasn't supposed to be that. They just threw that in at the last second to make it seem like something was gonna become something, but then it isn't anything. Okay, so X-Men Apocalypse is the next movie, and in that movie, they're just like doing their own thing and stuff, and there's this Quicksilver scene, and then out of fucking nowhere, William Stryker, Josh Hellman, but he's got a different haircut this time, he just shows up at the X-Men house. How did he even know to go there? I don't know. He just shows up out of nowhere, and he captures all the X-Men, and he brings them to the base where he does his experiments on mutants, and then they find Wolverine there, and guess what? Wolverine's there, and he put metal in Wolverine, because remember, he's William Stryker, and that's what William Stryker does. And then they escape, and Wolverine escapes, and that's the last time we see of him. I don't remember if they mentioned that he has a son in that movie, but it wouldn't surprise me. Anyways, so that's the William Stryker timeline. Are you all caught up? Remember, Brian Cox is William Stryker, and in X-Men 2, he fought in Vietnam. He has a son named Jason, and he put metal in Wolverine. We're going to mention this in as many movies as possible for some reason. It's weird, too, because in the comics, the guy who put metal in Wolverine is just like a different guy. And William Stryker is from like a totally different story. So it's not even like comically accurate that William Stryker is the guy that put metal in Wolverine, but they mentioned it in like every fucking movie, even in alternate timelines where things could be different. And we even imply that they might be, but then they just aren't. So, yeah. Anyways, this will be on the test.
Thanks for watching. This was actually part of a much longer video about the X-Men movies, so if you want to see more of me talking about X-Men, click the link here. That's it. Subscribe. See you next time with something else. Bye-bye.